Welcome to Free Thought Matters. I'm Dan Barker. During the Freedom from Religion Foundation's 40th annual convention in September 2017, the award-winning science educator and popular blogger Cara Santa Maria received our Free Thought Heroine Award. My co-president, Annie Laurie Gaylor, and I sat down with Cara at that time, and we asked her why she cares so much about atheism and science.
It's been really important for me in my career to kind of remove the stigma from a lot of things, from mental illness, from atheism, and of course from the celebration of being a nerd. And I think it's really cool to see that in popular culture, it's become more and more not just accepted, but I don't know, exciting, fun, trendy to be a nerd. I love that.
Well, our daughter has a necklace that says nerd, and she has one that says geek, and she goes to these geek, what is it, a Geek Fest thing, where they're proud of this being in science and all these nerdy, geeky things.
Absolutely.
Well, it means that society is embracing thought, intellectualism again, so it seems like a very good thing.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's funny because I do think that there's a bit of a dichotomy there. I think that the arrow is bending towards progress, absolutely. So if you look at history as a whole and kind of take a step back from it, yes, society is embracing intellectualism. I think we're moving forward, but sometimes you can get caught in these little microcosms, and right now we're not in the brightest time.
No, we aren't.
I listened to some of your podcasts, and you talk about all kinds of science, astrophysics, and earthquakes was the most recent one I listened to, and you know, psychology and the brain.
Yep.
A lot about the brain and how the neurons and Oliver Sacks and all of these things, which is fascinating stuff, but it's fun stuff.
Yeah, science is fun,
Yeah.
right? I think we have this preconceived notion that science is hard, or it's boring, or
esoteric.
It's stiff, or it's esoteric. And the truth is, when you're in it, you don't feel that way. I don't know any scientists who are like, ugh, I hate science, right? The problem is that it sometimes takes a while to get the background and the foundational knowledge that you need to feel like you're really in it. And so what I offer is a bit of a shortcut for that.
Yeah.
So it must be pretty exciting to be part of the new Bill Nye Netflix show. What's your role in that?
Yeah, it's really fun. So this season, or recently we finished season 2. In season 1 they had me on as an expert guest, but in season 2 they hired me to be a correspondent, which was a really big honor. So I did a couple of episodes, and I was able to go out into the field and interview a lot of people, do a fun field package about science, and then come back into studio and chat with Bill about everything that I learned. It was a lot of fun. It's a great show. It's really funny. It really brings science home, and it's good for Bill to be back on TV.
Now, all of the premier scientists, I mean, they've done studies on the top scientists are almost all non-religious. What's the connection?
It's interesting, you know, my personal connection is a little bit different than many people. And of course, everybody has their own path. But for me, I was an atheist long before I found science. For some people, it's the other way around. You know, they start studying science, and the deeper they get into science and philosophy, the less and less strong, I should say, that the more tenuous their relationship with religion becomes. For me, it was absolutely the opposite. And that's not to say that you can't be an incredibly prolific scientist and still believe in God. There are plenty of examples of that.
But it's a minority.
It is kind of a minority, and it depends on the field, but definitely in fields like astrophysics, the vast majority of individuals are non-religious or non-believers.
I think when you look at medicine, it gets a little different.
Yeah, exactly.
More religious.
I think for some people it's because they offer a similar sense of meaning and connectivity. You know, religion serves a real purpose in many people's lives, and science, not that it can fulfill that purpose completely, but it provides answers to some of the questions that I think people are seeking when they look towards religion for those answers. And so that's not to say if you became a scientist or you became incredibly scientifically minded, you would immediately lose your religion, but it is a common occurrence for individuals who do that.
But more than just answers, it also provides this awe and wonder and look at the stars and look at what we know. who needs a God when you have this real stuff to look at?
It's true. It gives people kind of that so-called spiritual religion. I think Carl Sagan spoke to that really beautifully in his writings and in his talks. You know, what a lot of people get out of religion, that spiritual feeling, many people can find in science. And not just that, it gives you a sense of connectivity to the universe as a whole. It shows you how in some ways we're very insignificant, and in other ways we have this really wonderful place within the cosmos.
Well, Cara, what was your background? Were you, excuse me, were you raised religious?
I was raised very, very religious. I was born into a Mormon family.
Really?
Yeah, I grew up in the South in Texas, and my father and my mother had converted before I was born. And so that's really all I knew when I was quite young. To be Mormon was to be alive, right? It's how I was raised. And I spent a lot of time working quite hard to be a good Mormon daughter. When I look back, I'm not sure I ever really believed.
Isn't the line that they give to Mormon girls, be sweet? Did you hear that?
Absolutely.
And what does that mean? Be submissive?
Well, there is that. I mean, like many sort of Judeo-Christian sects, I guess you could call them, there is a very kind of misogynistic bent to the church. While the boys would be off in their youth group learning life skills, the girls were learning domestic skills. You know, they were learning how to balance their checkbook, and we were learning how to bake cookies. So, you know, the sexism, yes, the sexism was pretty apparent. You know, and I tried really hard to please my parents, but I'm not sure I ever truly believed. So I ended up actually leaving the church when I was about 14 years old.
But you could have had your own planet. I mean, that would have been attractive.
Well, no, I'm a woman. I would never have had my own planet.
Oh, there you go. You had to be married, and you would be giving birth into perpetuity, correct?
Exactly. No,
well, how
that's
about a podcast,
true.
How to Talk About Sects?
Sect.
S-E-C-T-S,
yes,
right?
Not sex.
Because
sect.
there's these different sects that have these different opinions about women's place in the church and all that.
And the truth is, you know, depending on whether you're inside of it or outside of it, your perspective really does shift. So even how we talk about these things, some people would call the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints a cult, and other people would call it...
We did.
Yeah, exactly. And other people would call it just...
You're talking about as
my
a
evangelical
fundamentalist
background.
Protestant.
Mormons were this godless cult, really.
Exactly. Yeah, kind of like Jehovah's Witnesses as well. Whereas within the more kind of like Protestant persuasion, Mormonism's really not that different. They have their own book, and I think that's kind of apostasy for some people. But outside of that, it's really not that different from like being Methodist. And so it really depends on...
Maybe a little more conservative politically.
Yeah, I would think so. But you know what? The truth is, well, maybe because I grew up in the South, the Methodists there were pretty conservative too. It's true. So it's hard to make these generalizations. And there's even a portion within the Mormon Church that's quite progressive and liberal, that's really pushing to bring the church up to the time. So, you know, people are varied and they're vast.
But the bishops are not varied.
No, no. And
the white male bishops.
And that is something about the LDS Church that's very similar to a lot of other kind of Judeo-Christian religions, especially here in America. And so growing up religious, it's really all I knew until I decided to leave the church.
Well, so what was the epiphany? I mean, to be a 14 and be in a traditional Mormon house, that's pretty brave and pretty free thinking. I mean, how did you come to that?
I don't think I ever had a real epiphany. You know, looking back, I don't think I ever believed in it.
You just never really believed in it, and then you realized.
I tried really hard to. I wanted to please my parents, but the truth is, it didn't speak to me. It didn't make a lot of sense. It didn't seem reasonable. And as I got older, like many individuals within the LGBTQ community will tell you, there comes a time when you're lying to yourself, when you feel like you're not being true to yourself and you're not being fair. And eventually that sort of that dissonance inside of you becomes too much to bear.
Well, you know that story as having been a fundamentalist preacher.
Well, see, I admire you because when I was your age, I was totally, it was the truth. And I dedicated my life to preaching it, you know. And I wasn't stupid. I was smart. I mean, you were a smart young woman, and you saw that. Why didn't I? Why did it take some of us so long
I guess I wanted to please my parents and go along and do it, and it took a long time. And I think it's amazing that someone as a young teenager would just totally reject it.
You know, it's an interesting question to ask. Why do some people, you know, come to that decision earlier versus later? I think a lot of it really has to do with social support. Although I didn't have any atheist friends, and although I didn't know that there was an atheist community, in a way, some of the things that maybe contributed to my need for therapy in the future really were helpful. My parents had been divorced for many years, and I really found a strong kind of alliance in my mother. And my mother, deep down, I do think, had a free-thinking bent to her, and she was really supportive of me. She was really supportive of my sort of rebellious nature. And
so you weren't being punished or being treated, you know, shunned or...
Well, by my father, absolutely, you know. And so I think because I was able to find an ally, even though it wasn't overt and it wasn't outspoken, there was safety for me in knowing that I would probably still have the support of my mother regardless of what happened. Whereas if your parents are still married and they're kind of a unified front, and really all you know is religion, and there's an intense fear, even if it's subconscious, unconscious, and you don't even realize it's happening, there's this intense fear that you're going to let the people who you love the most down.
But I wasn't even there. I never even had the doubts. Jesus was real, and I talked to him, and he did miracles, and I thought you skeptics were just totally blind or sinful.
But
I mean,
you
I
did
was
not have the cognitive dissonance that you had. You
Yeah,
had some
so
parents
where
were
does that
slightly
come
different.
from?
why were you so quick to, you know?
It's tough,
And she
you
was
know?
raised without religion at all, so she never had to struggle with
But
any of
my
it's-
father was like you. He was raised in religion at 12. He said he never really accepted it, but he came out as a non-believer.
Well, he tells that cute story. He was sitting in church,
They were dunking him in the...
and he was looking
Oh.
around the congregation. He said, I was looking around the congregation, and it dawned on me, my parents are nuts. You know? He's a young kid, and that never would have dawned on me as a young kid, but
Well, now it has.
finally.
Yeah, you know, everybody comes to it in different ways, and everybody's lives are so incredibly different. I think we like to paint people with a broad brush, and we like to generalize based on upbringing, based on which religion they were raised in, you know, which part of the country they were in, their socioeconomic status. But the truth is, nobody had your experience, and nobody really had mine. We are too individualistic. And it's very hard to point to what those factors really are.
But it's because I had the truth and you didn't.
Exactly.
That's what it was.
I found the truth.
Well, no, but I think it's extraordinary because given your background, look who you've become. A major science educator, a personality for science, a cheerleader for rational thought. So your background did form, I think, that commitment perhaps.
And I think that there were intrinsic personality traits that spoke to both of those big decisions in my life. First, the decision to leave the church and to become a little bit more outspoken about my lack of belief. And then later in life, the decision to actually find and follow science and kind of that line of inquiry. Because like many young women, when I was first, even in college, all through high school and definitely in college, I was scared of science. I did not ever have any anticipation, any interest in becoming a scientist. I avoided my science classes like the plague. I avoided math classes like the plague. I had all of those same traits that I think a lot of young women develop because of societal influence. And not until I started studying psychology and sort of got an in with neuroscience did I really begin to embrace science and celebrate it.
And now you're pursuing your PhD.
I am. You know, soon after my master's, I did continue on, and I had started a PhD. This was about 10 years ago, and eventually decided to leave. I had been just going for so long, and I think I really needed a break. It wasn't quite the right program for me, and that's really when I switched gears and went into public science communication as a career. And so I've been out of school for a long time, but I just went back. I've started my PhD. I'm in like the second week of school, and I already have so many papers due.
And on top of everything else, and what else are you doing? I mean,
oh my
you have
gosh, a lot.
a weekly Tell us.
I do. I have a weekly podcast. Talk Nerdy comes out every Monday. I'm also one of the co-hosts on the Skeptics Guide to the Universe, which comes out every Saturday. So I have to set aside time to prepare for that and to record that with the 4 guys that are on the show. With Talk Nerdy, not only do I host it, but I produce it, I edit it, I do all the work myself. Wow. So it's a lot.
Talk Nerdy is a radio or it's a
podcast also. Yeah, they're both just audio podcasts. So that does help because I can do it in my pajamas. And then I do television, and television is, it's a career that ebbs and flows. So right now I am a correspondent on Bill Nye Saves the World. I do some work on a local news and current affairs show called SoCal Connected. But things come and go, I just had the honor to cover the total solar eclipse for National Geographic. I did a live stream for them, so I do a lot of one-off projects as well. All that, plus full-time in school. And of course I give talks. I travel the country and give many, many talks as part of my career as a freelancer. So it's really just about making sure that this very checkered quilt all comes together.
So I have another question. When are we going to get of course not the second, when are we going to get a book?
I know. It's so funny because I have a literary agent and I've had different publishers that I've spoken with in the past about putting something out. And I don't know if I'm making excuses. It may be that I really honestly don't have the time, but there's something, everybody wants that memoir. They say the first book should be really personal and autobiographical. I'm 33 years old, so I'm not a spring chicken, but I still feel like, what do I have to say? I haven't lived enough of my life yet to have that story. There's a part of me that's still resistant to writing it because I feel like I need more time.
Also, well, just so you know, I remember when I was in my 20s with a feminist newspaper, I had the great pleasure of interviewing Gloria Steinem before she had a book. I mean, she had all those articles, magazine articles, the Ms. magazine, and I think she was over 50 or 50 before she wrote her first book, and look at her now.
Exactly.
So I know it'll be great when you get around to it. Don't mean to put the pressure on.
She had that great line where she said, "When I'm writing, it's the only time when I don't think I should be doing something else." She was so driven. And you're right, it has to be one of these things that you can't not do.
Exactly.
When you're ready for it,
Yeah, and I think most writers, they know, It can be painful. There are plenty of people who write for a living where it's not just magic and the words don't always flow, but there is this motivation, this really intrinsic motivation that's there. And I'm sort of on the fence still about it. I think I'm getting close.
So what do we need to do differently in this country? And I suppose let's not talk so much about our president and the administration, although this is, a huge challenge. But in terms of science education, where do we go wrong?
It's tough. I think that a lot of it starts quite young. I don't think that we have the strongest educational system in our country. But even beyond that, I think it's a mechanism of social change. So yes, we do need to be working harder to ensure that as really littles, when we're first learning how to read, when we're first learning how to do arithmetic, when we're pointing to our shapes, that we're exercising critical thinking and that we're really contributing to a safe environment for children to fail and for children to try and go out on a limb. We're contributing to a safe environment where there's not always a right answer. I think that rote memorization is prioritized above all, and that's quite dangerous. So there's a lot that we can do within the educational system, but even beyond that, the idea that intellectualism, that being smart, is not something to be proud of in our culture is really detrimental. Yeah. So I think we need to see...
Well, we've got a president at the moment who uses his bully pulpit for not smart things.
Absolutely, but when we think about, the kind of horrible situation that we're in with Donald Trump, we have to remember that he didn't create this problem. He's feeding into a problem that's been in existence for quite some time. He did get elected. You know what I mean? It's not
Although he didn't have the popular vote.
He did not have the popular vote, but he was darn close. And that's something that we have to remember. It's not just him. It's all the people that also voted for him. And it's all the individuals who, for whatever reason, have grown up in a society and a culture that did not prioritize individual critical thinking. And so that's really something that we need to see change.
I like the fact that you're not just talking about science education, you're talking about critical thought.
Yeah, it underlies everything.
And some of the narrative of some of those Trump voters was a pushback against what they call the intellectual elites, right? There's something, you know, the scientists in that. Let's not trust them. Let's just trust our gut or whatever, or trust our God. And you're right, that's a big problem. It's disrespect.
It shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what the scientific method is. You know, there's a lot of distrust because we're so used to politicians saying no regrets, no apologies. We're used to seeing that when a politician changes their mind and has a more evolved opinion, that they're a flip-flopper, that they're not being true to who they are. But the truth of the matter is that in science, we're constantly learning from our mistakes. And the methodology is such that we're always working to achieve truth, even though we're never quite there. And because of a lack of understanding that science actually can be misconstrued as a fundamentalist viewpoint, which it absolutely is not, and individuals can be a little bit confused or disheartened when they see that, well, those scientists keep getting it wrong. If they keep getting it wrong, why should I trust them? It really comes down to a lack of understanding of what the scientific method is.
But the way they know it's wrong is with more science,
exactly.
right? Science corrects itself with not superstition, but with more science. So
it is.
It's better science.
It's the kind of, it's like the opposite of dogma. And of course, that's not always the case. There is dogma even within the scientific community that we're always fighting against, but at least kind of in an ideal world,
it's self-correcting.
It's self-correcting, and it fights back against dogma.
Now, we have seen in 2017 a slight shift, finally, with the polls that I think for the first time in history, a majority of Americans do not subscribe to creationism. Have you seen that? It was like in the 40 percentiles for adult Americans. But I'm wondering how many of those creationists voted a certain way in the last election. I mean, I wonder if we've done a survey on that.
Yeah.
To my mind, American ignorance on evolution is a black eye on our nation, but I think it harms us in so many other ways. So what kind of science education are you doing in terms of this evolution and correcting this record?
It's interesting because evolution has become a politicized topic, and I shouldn't even say has become, it's always been a politicized topic. When Darwin was first publishing his theories, he was afraid to talk about humans at the beginning. He waited until another book because he knew it would be so politicized. And so I think that it depends on who your audience is. You know, if you're speaking to individuals who are already a bit uncomfortable about the idea that humans evolved, then maybe you discuss it in a way that feels a little bit more safe. You know, I was raised Mormon, and my father has a very interesting relationship with evolution because in a way he's very pro-science, like many Mormons are. He thinks that evolution exists, but he doesn't think that evolution is actually the cause of speciation, which is sort of fundamental to the whole process. And so you do start to see that within different religious viewpoints, there's nuance, even in these types of what we think of as third rail issues. And so, yes, there are always going to be a small percentage, and hopefully it's getting smaller and smaller, as you pointed out, that has a very fundamentalist view. But the truth of the matter is that most individuals have at least some amount of rational, critical thought, independent thought, and most people try and fit all their worldviews together to make sense of the whole. And I think that if we can speak to people where they are, instead of making them feel stupid, telling them that they're wrong, but showing them the science as it fits with their preconceived notions, you'll start to see this change, this shift, and the worldviews will begin to broaden. But if you make them have to shut down immediately and say, I can't listen because everything you're saying goes against everything I believe, then it's very hard to get in and have that conversation.
Well, that's how I was as a kid. Growing up in the church, I thought we human beings were above nature in some way. And to think that we're animals was an insult. Don't tell me that I'm an animal, right? Which is in fact what we are. We are animals, right? And to acknowledge that fact, I think that's one of the big problems, is that science is telling you believers, you're not above. There's no transcendent. There's no soul in the brain. You're just one of these other animals on the planet. And to them, that feels like a put down. You're putting me down. You're lowering me. Why shouldn't we embrace the lower nature that we have, which is real, instead of trying to reach up to something in the sky? And if we could get to kids before they start thinking that there's something above and beyond nature, would be a big advance.
And on the flip side of that, also there's this this viewpoint within fundamentalist communities that there's no way I could ever be contributing to climate change. There's no way people can do that. What hubris to think that I would have an effect. If God wants it to be that way, then it's going to be that way. And so it is difficult, right? Because what we don't want to do is threaten any individual sense of who they are, their sense of importance, their fundamental sense of individuality. That's meaningful from a psychological perspective. And going in and threatening that is the surest way for somebody to stop listening to you. But there are little things that we can do to meet people where they are. A great example, I was at Dragon Con maybe a year or two ago, which is a great convention in Atlanta. Yeah, celebrating nerd culture. There you go. People love to dress up at Dragon Con. And I was on a panel about science communication, and one of the other panelists talked about going into churches to talk about climate change, and how did they frame their arguments and their conversations within these churches that allowed them to come in. And they said they did these little nuanced things, like when they would show a graph of the trend in global climate, instead of starting their graph at billions of years ago or even millions of years ago, very subtle, their graph went back 6,000 years. They didn't talk about the Earth only being 6,000 years. They didn't mention that they disagree with that viewpoint. But what would happen is that somebody would look at that graph and they would go, okay, all right, so what can I get out of that? Instead of going, millions of years, the Earth's not that old. This person doesn't know what they're talking about. I might as well stop listening to everything else they say. And so it wasn't really that they were giving an inch, it's that they were meeting them where they were, and I thought that that was a really smart approach.
So we have about 2 minutes here. We're out of time. Is there a final?
Well, the importance of science, especially with climate change. Can you leave us with some parting thoughts?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that we need to remember how incredibly useful our long history of scientific exploration has been for humankind. I mean, you can't walk down the street without using the products of science every day. But we must also remember that science is an endeavor that is followed through by individual people and their own emotional states, their psychological states, and their hopes and their dreams really feed into that entire narrative. And so we shouldn't be such staunch followers. I mean, I'm a materialist, I'm an atheist, I really, really value evidence-based thought, but at the same time, let's not lose our humanity when we have those conversations. They really do go hand in hand.
Well, thank you, Cara. This was really fun.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for all your education.
Of course.
And making it fun.
And thanks for having me.